war, protests, human rights abuses, peace talks and politicians. From Iraq to Afghanistan, from Zuccotti Park to the Maidan, societies experiencing complex challenges have highly visible symbols. These symbols, they dominate our headlines, they fill our news feeds, they shape perceptions about what the problems are in these countries and what solutions might be needed to promote sustainable change. But like bacteria in the body or cancer that remains unseen to the naked eye, the pathology of a society, of a problem, is often invisible. It's mired in complexity, and so it can remain untreated. In response, we often treat the symptoms of problems, but we don't address underlying causes. So we're better at providing food stamps than we are at combating poverty, or we're better at looking after refugees than we are at dealing with civil war. One of the problems with this tendency to focus on symptoms rather than underlying causes is that we can inadvertently sustain or even make worse the underlying pathology. This is the situation with addiction, for example, where an addict will seek to treat itself, but in doing so reinforce the underlying pattern of dependence, which is a problem in the first place. In system thinking, this is known as a balancing loop, or a pattern of relations whereby the efforts to change a situation actually maintain the status quo.
So today we're going to talk about some of the invisible forces that shapes the outcome in peace and reform processes. And we're going to give some examples of Myanmar, the country where we live and work. And Myanmar has over the few past years undergone some remarkable changes. Thousands of political prisoners have been released. Nobel laureates are out of jail and into politics. We have peace agreements, we have the first democratic elections, and an economic boom. But we also have protests, religious violence, and ongoing armed conflict. So what we want to understand is, with all of this symbolic change, has the underlying patterns that cause the problems in Myanmar, have they really changed? So first of all, we need to look at what do the people in Myanmar, what kind of change do they want? Well, like most countries moving from authoritarianism to democracy, they are looking for a change whereby there's a system where currently there's a few stakeholders that hold all of the power and resources, to a system where power and resources are shared.
So is this goal being achieved? To try and examine this question, we're going to look at some of the political changes as well as the economic changes in Myanmar in the last few years using systems mapping. We're going to look at what's visible, and we're going to look at what's less visible, and we're going to talk about some of the connections between those. So at the start of the transition, about 2010, a series of highly visible reforms. Now this is significant because it made the international community take notice. Sanctions were dropped. This meant that Myanmar could benefit from international assistance as well as private investment from the companies from our shores. But in terms of trying to address that underlying pathology of the concentration of resources, very little has actually changed since then. So you still have a constitution which enshrines the military's hold on power. And in the peace process, you have some ceasefire agreements, but no concessions in terms of resource or power sharing to other groups in the country. So you have this paradoxical situation whereby you have all of this surface change, but the core dynamics of power beneath the surface are much the same as they always have been. And there are a range of further, less visible factors which are very important. The first of which is who controls the economy. So in Myanmar, as in other transition countries, you have essentially an oligarchic system. You have a few very large companies that control most of the economy, and they've won this through their links to the military or to the government. You also have an economic system in which patronage plays a very important role. So in practice, that means that much new investment tends to flow up towards people that are already in power. Now this is quite hard to see, certainly hard to regulate, because you have very low levels of transparency and you have very high levels of corruption. So I want to focus a little bit on one very important connection between what's happening politically and economically in the country. And that's the international community's reaction to all of these visible changes to lift sanctions is ushering in a huge amount of foreign investment. And while the country needs that investment, because of these invisible rules that govern the economy, much of that investment is actually serving to enrich the people that have been in power in their country for the last 50 years. So in other words, it's counteracting all of the political efforts to try and balance or share power more fairly.
Another hidden pattern that inadvertently empowers the already dominant power holder is that of international aid to health and education services in Myanmar. And that the aid, what I'm talking about, is the kind of aid that our governments and the UN and INGO supports. And that kind of aid funding has been increasing massively in Myanmar over the last few years. And most of that has been going in accordance to the normal standard aid model, where aid mainly goes through and to the government. So in terms of health and education systems, this means strengthening the government systems and policies, training more teachers and health workers, and building more schools and clinics. And all of that sounds great, right? Well, unfortunately not, or at least not if we're talking in terms of resource and power sharing. We have ethnic armed groups that are currently in negotiations with the government that have been providing these services in parallel in areas outside of government control for years. So what they really would like to have out of this peace process is some kind of federal system or some type of autonomy and resource sharing. The problem then is that if we come in with international funding that mainly goes through the government, we potentially starve the parallel system out of its funding. So this alters this balance of power in support of a state actor in terms of, and against non-state actors. So it creates a balancing loop whereby the international aid both supports through the civil society and ethnic and democratic forces, but also through its supports to government undermines the sharing of power and resources.
So up to this point, it's sounding a little bit pessimistic. International investment, supporting military hardmen, education funding, undermining peace process, but it's really not that bad. It just suggests a recalibration of who we're supporting and how we're supporting them. So this type of analysis would suggest two things. The first, and this is something we really want to emphasize, is that invisible needs to be made visible. So in practical terms, you need mechanisms, civil society organizations, and independent media that can shine a light on corrupt practices, that can bring transparency and accountability into business, into governments, and really it's about providing checks and balances on dominant power holders, which till this point in time pretty much have unchecked power. But in terms of investment from our shores, there's also a responsibility to make sure that it's socially responsible. And by this, it means making sure that cronies and people that have previously sanctioned and people that have committed human rights abuses aren't receiving benefits from new investment. It's about supporting a model of economic development which is broad-based and benefits more people. And there are some investors that are doing it, but it needs to happen a lot more.
So changing the way that we deliver international aid will be hard, but it's important that we rebalance our support. And this doesn't mean that we cannot support governments. What is critical is that we also need to be able to support the emergence of alternative power centers. So in terms of countries, that means relaxing some of our policies so that it's easier to support non-state actors. It is also important to support ethnic administration, democratic opposition, and citizen engagement, which are these alternative power centers. And these can counterbalance the traditional power of the state and economic and military powers. So the potential impacts of these efforts, of the combined changes in the way that we do aid and the way that we do foreign investments, this can actually shift some of the status quo to ensure that we have more shared power and more resources. And these are creating these reinforcing loops that we're seeing here on these maps.
So to finish off, I would say that none of these changes are going to happen very quickly, but these changes need to occur by bringing hidden patterns into the open where they can be deliberated on, confronted, and ultimately transformed. This is what complexity theorists call conditions of bounded instability. This is what parliaments do. This is what the peace process should do. Thank you very much for your time.